Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, December 8th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. U.S. says there is no deadline for Israel's Gaza onslaught. So U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner said on Thursday that the Biden administration has not set a deadline on Israel's war in Gaza and reiterated U.S. opposition to a ceasefire. Feiner said, quote, "We have not given a firm deadline to Israel, not really our role. That is their conflict. That said, we do have influence, even if we don't have ultimate control over what happens on the ground in Gaza," end quote. So when it comes to the timeline of this war, how long it could last, there was a report in Financial Times last week that cited Israeli sources who said they expect it to last over a year. I mean, imagine this thing going on for a whole year. U.S. officials have said that they expect the current phase in the war, referring to the ground operations and the constant bombardment, they expect that to last into 2024. And then at some point, they're saying Israel will probably narrow down its operations to take out specific Hamas fighters. They say that could happen as soon as January. But who knows? I mean, Israel seems to be pretty happy with just obliterating the Gaza Strip. Feiner said that the U.S. supports Israel's goal of ensuring that Hamas can no longer govern. Although we've seen Netanyahu and Israeli officials, they're constantly saying their goal is to eliminate Hamas, which is a different goal from what the U.S. is saying, that to make sure they can't govern Gaza. Feiner said that the U.S. is, quote, "not in place yet of asking Israel to stop or for a ceasefire," end quote. So reiterating that no ceasefire, we want to continue supporting this thing. Gaza's health ministry put out another casualty update on Thursday. They said at least 17,177 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th, and that total includes about 70% of that is women and children. And their death toll is considered to be on the low end, something that the U.S. State Department has admitted. They're not accounting for the people buried under the rubble, which is in the thousands. There's thousands of people who are missing. They don't have heavy machinery to properly dig people out. So the Financial Times report cited a source who said that Israel was not near halfway to achieving its objectives. And the death toll that an Israeli military source said when it comes to the Hamas fighters, they're claiming that they've killed 5,000 Hamas members, although there were other reports citing Israeli sources who put the death toll between 1,000 and 2,000. Either way, who knows if these estimates are accurate, but either way, they've killed more children than both of them. I believe the child death toll is now around 7,000, which is just horrific. And the White House is still insisting that Israel does not intentionally target civilians. That's something John Kirby said this week. And there was that report from 972 magazine, which is an Israeli magazine that was very thoroughly sourced, had Israeli intelligence sources who said that actually Israel is purposely, destroying high-rise buildings and other civilian infrastructure. And the purpose of this, they say, is to put civil pressure on Hamas. The idea is the civilians would, rise up and put pressure on Hamas in response to Israel destroying their homes. And there was actually an interesting article in Foreign Affairs about this, and saying that never in the history of air campaigns has that worked. Has bombing a city, have the residents turned on their own government or in the case of Hamas, whatever force is embedded there. There's been a lot of criticism of Israel's bombing campaign in the mainstream media just because it's so glaringly horrific what they're doing. Everybody can see all the children that they're killing. And this next one here is from Financial Times, and it's about the scale of Israel's air campaign. Israel's air campaign is one of the heaviest in history. It opens with an interesting quote from Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu, at least in private, has been blunt about what Israel needs most to destroy Hamas, a steady supply of more U.S. bombs. He said he recently told a group of local government officials, quote, "We need 3 things from the U.S., munitions, munitions, and munitions," end quote. He also mentioned that there are huge demonstrations in Western capitals, and he's concerned that the political pressure could disrupt all these weapon shipments that he's getting from the U.S. He said, quote, "We need to apply counter pressure. There have been disagreements with the best of our friends," end quote. So Israel's using a ton of bombs that are being provided by the U.S., including, there's all different types. There's the bunker busting bombs, smart bombs, dumb bombs, just all sorts of munitions that they're dumping on the Gaza Strip. And the damage has been catastrophic, and this report actually compares it to the most heavily bombed cities of World War II in Germany. Citing estimates of damage to urban areas, military analysts say the destruction of northern Gaza in less than 7 weeks has approached that caused by the years-long carpet bombing of German cities during the Second World War. They quote Robert Pape, who's a U.S. military historian and author of Bombing to Win. He said, quote, "Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, some of the world's heaviest ever bombings are remembered by their place names. Gaza will also go down as a place name denoting one of history's heaviest conventional bombing campaigns," end quote. So they have a little chart here. It shows northern Gaza, and it says 68% of the buildings in northern Gaza have been damaged. During World War II, 75% of the buildings in Hamburg were damaged, 61% in Cologne, and 59% in Dresden. I mean, these are, for me, whenever I think of Dresden, whenever I hear that name, I think of the bombing of World War II, the destruction that was caused by the Allied bombing and the tens of thousands of civilians that were killed. And this is saying that there's more damage in northern Gaza than there was to Dresden. So it really puts it, I think, into perspective. And they show some pictures here of Dresden and the aftermath of these bombings. All right, so the next one here, inside a Gaza hospital. So this story is very horrific, but I figured I would read some of it. It describes a scene inside a southern Gaza hospital, and this article is actually from The Independent. Again, I'm running kind of mainstream sources that I normally is normally rare for us to run kind of at the top page, because usually their coverage isn't very good, but they're just saying what's happening, and it's just so horrific. So I'll just read from some of this article, and it's pretty rough. A badly burned toddler screaming for the mother he doesn't know is dead, and screaming because doctors do not have enough painkillers to relieve his suffering. An 8-year-old boy whose brain is exposed as bombing damaged parts of his skull. A teenage girl, her eyes surgically removed because every bone in her face is smashed. A 3-year-old double amputee whose severed limbs are laid out in a pink box beside him. And in the background is the stench of rotting flesh as maggots creep out of untreated wounds. This is the daily reality at the European hospital inside the southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis, as described by veteran British war surgeon Tom Potokar, who works for the International Committee of the Red Cross. So just such a horrific scene. And, I mention a lot the number of Palestinians who have been killed, the number of children who have been killed. But there's also at least 40,000 wounded Palestinians. And I'm not sure, out of that number, how many are children, probably tens of thousands who are wounded. And I mean, these are serious injuries that they're talking about here. A 3-year-old double amputee. And there's still children trapped under the rubble. I mean, you really think about this and read these accounts. It's just, how are people justifying this, supporting this? Especially if you're in the U.S., even if you're pro-Israel. I mean, why should our tax dollars be funding, this slaughter of children that's happening? It's just so horrific. And there's no end in sight. And all this stuff about civilian concerns that we're hearing from Blinken, Biden, Kirby, all these people, it's just all, they might as well not be saying anything. All right, so the next one here, investigation finds Israeli tank shell killed a journalist in Lebanon. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So there's a big investigation into the killing of a Reuters journalist in southern Lebanon. And this joint investigation was conducted by Reuters, AFP, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. And they found on October 13th that an Israeli tank conducted a lethal attack on journalists in southern Lebanon. Since October 7th, Israeli military operations have killed and injured scores of journalists across Lebanon, the West Bank, and Gaza. The investigators concluded that the Israeli tank shelled a group of easily identified journalists. Reuters videographer Issam Abdallah was murdered. AFP photographer Christina Assi was severely injured. Other journalists from Reuters, AFP, and Al Jazeera were also wounded. So they quoted an AFP videographer who was there at the scene and when the Reuters journalist was killed, who said, quote, "We felt safe, we felt secure, so we got to work. 7 journalists, all of us wearing flak jackets and helmets, everyone clearly marked as a member of the press. The Israelis knew we were there from the moment we arrived," end quote. AFP said in the report that the strikes were deliberate and targeted. So they're saying that they deliberately killed this group of journalists. And yeah, 7 journalists wearing, they wear the vests that say press, helmets that say press. It should be very obvious to any modern military. All right, so the next one here, the Senate votes down a resolution to leave Syria. So the Senate on Thursday voted down a resolution that would have directed President Biden to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria, where U.S. forces have come under frequent attack in response to President Biden's support for Israel's Gaza onslaught. The bill failed in a vote of 13 to 84, so it didn't do very well, but it did receive bipartisan support. 7 Democrats voted for it, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent, which was Bernie Sanders. The resolution was introduced by Senator Rand Paul, who argued the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria risks a major regional war. Paul said, quote, "Keeping 900 U.S. troops in Syria does nothing to advance American security. Rather, our intervention puts those service members at grave risk by providing an enticing target for Iranian-backed militias. Our continued presence risks the United States getting dragged into yet another regional war in the Middle East without debate or a vote by the people's representatives in Congress. Congress must cease abdicating its constitutional war powers to the executive branch," end quote. So this bill would have directed Biden to withdraw the troops within 30 days unless he could get a authorization from Congress. So this resolution received support from Robert Ford, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Syria. In fact, he was the U.S. ambassador to Syria under Obama from 2011 to 2014 when the U.S. threw its weight behind the regime change operation against Bashar al-Assad. And he has been supportive of lately, in recent time, with getting the U.S. withdrawing from Syria and lifting sanctions, saying, somebody very involved in the beginning of the U.S. intervention against Assad and what has led to, what led to that brutal war and all the funding of these, extremist groups in Syria. And now kind of the where we're at now, it's a continuation with the sanctions that the U.S. has on Syria. They're specifically designed to prevent the country from rebuilding after that war and this occupation of eastern Syria. And this guy Ford thinks it should end. So he said, quote, "We owe our soldiers serving there in harm's way a serious debate about whether their mission is in fact achievable. Absent a debate and authorization of such a mission, our troops should be removed," end quote. So the U.S. has launched several rounds of airstrikes against Shia militias in Syria and Iraq in response to rocket and drone attacks that have targeted U.S. bases since October 17th. The U.S. bombings, which have killed dozens of militia members, have not deterred further attacks, and now the region is a powder keg, and it really could explode at any moment. And the U.S. maintains that its presence in eastern Syria is about fighting ISIS, but realistically, it is about this campaign against Damascus. They want to stay there as a check against Iran in the region. That's what it's all about, controlling the oil fields in eastern Syria. So unfortunately, that bill failed pretty badly, but at least some people are looking to get the U.S. troops out of there. All right, so I want to mention again that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com that we kicked off this week. And this is how I'm able to do this show, is because I work for antiwar.com, and we are entirely funded by our readers. So we have to do these fundraisers a few times a year, and it's that time again. And I really appreciate everybody that supports us, and it's tough to have to ask people for money. But again, this is the only way this can happen. This is the only way we can be antiwar.com and be as anti-war and non-interventionist as we are. No matter what happens, when it comes to politics, we will never compromise on our position. So go to antiwar.com/donate and see the different ways that you could support us. Credit card, PayPal, crypto. You could set up a monthly donation. Any little bit helps. So if you have the means, please help support antiwar.com. All right, so where are we here? The next one, the U.S. tells Israel not to strike the Houthis in Yemen. So the Biden administration has asked Israel not to respond to recent attacks by Yemen's Houthis, and this was reported by the Wall Street Journal on Thursday. So the Houthis, who are formerly known as Ansar Allah, they have fired missiles and drones at Israel in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza and have targeted Israeli-linked commercial ships in the Red Sea. U.S. warships have responded to the Houthi attacks and have downed several Houthi missiles and drones in recent weeks. The U.S. is concerned that an Israeli response could spark a major regional war. U.S. officials told Israel that the U.S. would handle any potential response, although Politico reported that the administration is not planning on directly targeting the Houthis, at least for now. So that is good. At least it doesn't seem like the U.S. is planning to bomb Yemen. The Politico report said that the Pentagon has drawn up plans to strike the Houthis, but they have not been presented or recommended to President Biden. The report said that there is a high-level consensus within the administration that it does not make sense for the U.S. military to respond directly to the Houthis. And Saudi Arabia is also urging the U.S. not to strike the Houthis over concerns that the attack could jeopardize the Saudi-Houthi peace process. There's been a ceasefire since April 2022. That's held relatively well, still some fighting on the ground, but a lasting peace deal has not been signed, so the situation could always escalate. But it's good that the U.S. is telling Israel not to do anything and the Saudis are telling the U.S. not to do anything, because we don't want to see this. This could really escalate if the U.S. started bombing the Houthis directly. The U.S. announced sanctions targeting the Houthis on Thursday over this alleged network that gives them money. It sounds like it's just people trading with each other. They make it sound so illicit when the Treasury Department sanctions people, but they say that they sanction people allegedly involved in the sale and shipment of Iranian commodities to Yemen. That's the big crime here. So free trade is not something the U.S. government likes. But the fact that they're issuing sanctions, that's so they could say, hey, we're doing something. And it's good that they're not just dropping bombs. But, we shouldn't rule it out as a possibility. All right, so the next one here, extremist march at Al-Aqsa aborted over police probe. So that march that was going to happen at the Al-Aqsa Mosque or Temple Mount, to demand Jewish control of Al-Aqsa Mosque, which would have been very provocative and could have really sparked something in the region, was canceled. Participants showed up and they started marching, but the police said that they were disobeying them. They were violating certain things, and there was racist chants, and they decided to call it quits. Says they were chanting, "Death to Arabs, we must build the third temple, and the third temple is ours." So they want to build the temple where Al-Aqsa Mosque is. So this has always been a point of contention since the Zionists started showing up to Palestine in the late 1800s. But, the tensions over this part, Al-Aqsa, started in the early 1900s. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to help Ukraine increase its own arms production. Ukrainian officials travel to Washington this week to attend a conference on building up Ukraine's own military-industrial complex to reduce its reliance on the West for military equipment. Opening the conference on Wednesday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. and its allies would work to strengthen Ukraine's defense industrial base, which is the new lingo for military-industrial complex. And he's saying this will maintain Ukraine's current war effort and bolster deterrence in the future. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told Reuters, quote, Ukraine becoming more self-sufficient in weapons production obviously alleviates the long-term need for continued supply of weapons from the United States and other Western countries, end quote. The U.S. and Ukraine are also looking to jointly produce arms. A Ukrainian minister who attended the conference said that Kiev had an agreement with two American companies to jointly manufacture 155mm artillery shells, which are in short supply as the U.S. has shipped millions to support the war against Russia. I believe they've given Ukraine over 2 million of those artillery shells. So Ukraine has successfully produced drones domestically that it has used in the war with Russia, including sea drones that it used to attack the Crimean Bridge, the second time they attacked the Crimean Bridge, which was earlier this year. So the Wall Street Journal had a report on this, and they pointed out these sea drones, which are called Sea Babies, as an example of Ukraine making its own weapons. But it jogged my memory, and that Washington Post report from a few months back that detailed the CIA support for the Ukrainian intelligence services said that those sea drones were actually developed as part of a top secret operation involving the CIA and other Western intelligence services. So kind of an interesting piece of information I thought to include. And other Western arms makers have agreed to produce weapons inside Ukraine despite the risk of their factories becoming targets of the Russian military. Earlier this year, the German arms maker Rheinmetall announced that it would be opening a tank production facility in Ukraine. So this is a big part of the long-term U.S. and NATO plans for Ukraine, is to build up this big arms industry that they can all make money off. All right, so the next one here, U.S. military conducting flight operations in Guyana. So there are tensions between Venezuela and Guyana, and of course, the U.S. military is now conducting military exercises in Guyana. So the U.S. military said Thursday that it would conduct flight operations in Guyana amid tensions between the Caribbean nation and its neighbor Venezuela over the disputed Guyana-Essequibo region. Guyana-Essequibo, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I meant to double check, but I don't know too much about this dispute. It goes back a long time. Guyana is a very small country in between Venezuela and Suriname, which is also a very small country. I actually know a lot of people from Guyana. The population is only like 800,000, but when I used to work on the Staten Island ferry, because a lot of people from Guyana work on ships and then they moved to the U.S., so it was a good job for them to get. A lot of Guyanese work there. But a lot of people, aren't aware of, Guyana. It's such a small country. But anyway, Guyana gained independence from Britain in 1966. So I just put in some kind of basic history of this dispute. In 1899, in a tribunal that was actually the 5 people on this tribunal, 2 were American, 2 were British, and there was 1 Russian who was thought to be more neutral. The Americans were supposed to be representing the Venezuelans. The Britons were representing themselves. So that's part of the reason why Venezuela has rejected this ruling. They say they weren't really properly represented. But anyway, this tribunal ruled that this area, Guyana-Essequibo, belonged to Guyana, then the British Empire. So the Venezuela has kind of always rejected that. And they reached a new agreement in 1966, right before Guyana gained independence from the crown, known as the Geneva Agreement. And that basically said the two sides agree to reach a mutually satisfactory solution to the dispute. And the International Court of Justice opened a case into the dispute in 2018, but a decision is still expected to be years away. So if you look at the map here, Essequibo is about 2/3 of the territory of Guyana. It's a big chunk of the country. Population-wise, though, it's dense jungle. Not too many people live there. The population's around 125,000 out of the 800,000 people who live in Guyana. So it's very rural, but there's a lot of oil resources and oil reserves offshore as well. So that's kind of a big part of this. So this dispute has escalated. Tensions have risen as there's been more oil discoveries. And the American energy giant ExxonMobil discovered massive oil reserves off the coast of Guyana in waters that are claimed by Venezuela. And Exxon has been involved in a major offshore drilling project. So anyway, the current tensions, this dispute escalated this week. Venezuela held a referendum on Sunday for people to vote on turning Guyana Essequiba into a Venezuelan state. And the Venezuelans voted to do it. So Maduro, the Venezuelan president, declared that he said he ordered the creation of a state. He came out with a map showing the area as a state of Venezuela. So this has raised fears of potential military action. But at the same time, Venezuela and Guyana have said that they have agreed to keep talking about this issue. And the U.S. is backing Guyana in the dispute. Of course, Secretary of State Antony Blinken reaffirmed this in a phone call with Guyana's president, Irfan Ali, on Wednesday. According to the State Department, Blinken said that the two sides should respect the 1899 ruling, quote, unless or until the parties reach a new agreement or a competent legal body decides otherwise, end quote. According to the U.S. Embassy in Guyana, U.S. Southern Command planned to conduct flights with the Guyanese military on Thursday. So they're calling them military exercises, but they're trying to frame it, kind of as routine engagement. But it does seem to be a response to the tensions that are going on here. And so the U.S. recently eased some sanctions on Venezuela. I don't think anything significant. In 2019, the U.S. tried to overthrow Maduro, tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government by backing a failed coup against him, led by Juan Guaido, who the U.S. recognized as president of Venezuela. But that failed, but the U.S. did impose very harsh sanctions on Venezuela that essentially amount to an economic blockade. They've lifted some recently, but now they're threatening to reimpose them. So we'll see how this all plays out. Hopefully they just keep talking. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Ramzi Baroud: dying to be free, releasing Palestinian captives is not a numbers game. One from Andrew Basevich: America's war for the greater Middle East continued. One from Doug Bandow: why join the military to defend everyone else except Americans? One from Edward Lazansky and Robert Zapochny: President Biden's war pigs. One from Gideon Levy: Israel is fostering next generation of hatred against itself. And that's Gideon Levy is an Israeli journalist, and he's really been speaking out against everything that's happening in Gaza. But that is it for me for today. That's it for the week. I hope everybody has a good weekend. Please help us out with our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. You could also help us just by sharing, commenting, telling your friends about antiwar.com. But that's it for me for today. I'll see you in a few days. Thanks for listening.